like minutes.
Northampton, New Hampshire.
Well, you know the reason it's flown by because you haven't allowed any calls. You just keep chatting. It sounds like the Susan Sontag leftist lecture this afternoon. But anyways, both Susans, I'd like to know, I've got 3 questions, if you allow me. I mean, all the way you've talked, you should allow a caller a few moments, and someone who isn't praising old Susan here. I'd like to know
What's your name, sir?
Sir?
What's your name, since you're so free with my first name?
My name is Decker, Bill Decker.
Okay,
Is
Bill.
that okay?
Just Bill to me, since I'm Susan to you.
Susan, I'd like to know what birthday I served in the Vietnamese War, and in Vietnam, and was a prisoner of war while you were over there. And you didn't. I'd like to know what birthday you celebrated with Ho Chi Minh. Well, you weren't real popular with we Marines, I can tell you that, young lady, and we were tortured over there. And even though you and Jane Fonda stood up and said we weren't,
I never said anything of the kind. Excuse me, Bill. You find a place that I said you were not tortured. I know perfectly well that American prisoners were badly mistreated in Hanoi, and I have said so. I never said anything to the contrary, and don't you dare mix me in with Jane Fonda. I'm my own person with my own statements. They are not the same as hers.
Doing in North Vietnam. You were there.
Go on with your question.
Okay, you won't answer that one. Okay, and I also wonder why you don't have a photograph of your book of that young CIA agent, Johnny Spann, who was beaten and eaten to death by the Taliban, and you say that there's such polarizing language by the right. How about words like Hitler Bush, blood for oil, all of these sort of things that you leftists throw around very, very quickly, and don't bother to call that polarizing language. And also the incineration of the Japanese you're talking about. Well, I had 2 brothers in Iwo Jima, Mrs. Sontag, or whatever you are, and they were, thank God, that Harry Truman had the sense to save their lives. They survived Iwo Jima and came home. And people like you saying, oh, my God, you're bombing, now you call it Hiroshima. Well, I was in Japan. It's Hiroshima, by the way. But anyway.
I never said Hiroshima.
Well, I know, but most of you folks do.
Well, I'm not most of the folks. Most of the leftists, most of those. What, you heard me say Hiroshima. Now, excuse me, why are you confusing me with a bunch of other folks? This is not going to get very far.
There is evidence that there is a tie-in with Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. That is evidence that has been put forth, that he has paid $25,000 per head for the killers' families who rode those airplanes into the Pentagon, into the World Trade Center, into that field in Pennsylvania. You deny it. You deny that they're over there today. Well, we captured one of their top lieutenants yesterday. Not a lieutenant, a general. A general. And we're going to find out a lot more about this. And you folks on the left are going to have to apologize for defending Saddam Hussein and attacking our great president.
Okay, Mr. Decker, we'll let you go at that point. Thanks for the call.
Yeah, nobody's defending Saddam Hussein, that's for sure.
There were other questions in there, such as on Vietnam. Why did you go to Hanoi in the first place?
I went because I was one of the founders and leaders of the anti-war movement. I was against the war in Vietnam, as a majority of Americans proved to agree with me, and I went on a fact-finding mission along with some American journalists, and it was absolutely a very educational experience. I did not make any of the statements that some other people made. I was completely aware of the mistreatment of American prisoners, and in fact made a point of visiting prisoners in and was horrified by what I saw.
You know, we listen here on Saturday afternoons to the Lyndon Johnson White House tapes. We have them from the LBJ archives, and it's a chance to hear the president in his thinking and defense of the policy at the time. Yeah.
But so many people, as you know, Susan, so many people involved with that war have said it was a mistake. Of course, I weep for the American soldiers who died, almost 70,000 soldiers who died. I weep for the millions of Vietnamese civilians who died. Let me just say once more, I am not a pacifist, but I do believe that most wars need not have happened. Let's just start with the First World War, which just about wrecked Europe. this is not a war that had to happen. And the fact that one's loved ones or relatives were in the war, you know, like this caller, you know, there's a very strong argument that Japan would have surrendered without dropping the bombs. And there's a real argument to that effect, an argument which I find convincing. You have to, in order to say that that those bombs were justified, you have to have to prove. Prove is the wrong word, of course. You have to reason that Japan would not have surrendered, that it would have taken an invasion and occupation of Japan to make Japan surrender. And I don't believe that that's the case. And I think there's evidence it's not the case. What's really horrible, and this is the thing to get back to, is that modern war, there is such a thing called modern war. Let's just talk about war in general. Let's talk about modern war. Modern war is mainly war against civilians. And that's why it's so horrible, and that's why we want to limit it. Let me just give you two facts. In the First World War, which was an unbelievably lethal war, and that basically wrecked Europe, and all the horrors of Stalin and Hitler and so on follow from what happened as a result of the First World War. In the First World War, 90% of the casualties, and they numbered in the many millions, were soldiers. 10% were civilians. In the Second World War, 90% of the casualties were civilians. I mean, you know, I talk about the incineration of Japanese cities. Well, more people died in the bombing of Hamburg than died in either the Allied bombing of Hamburg than died in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And the vast majority of these people were women and children. The vast majority, because Hamburg had very few men at that time. They were almost all, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people died in the bombing of Hamburg. And they were all women and children. Now, that's what modern war is. And that's why we have to outgrow war, I think, because war has become mainly targeting civilians. If war could still be fought between armies, I think we'd have more case for war than we have now. And that's something I want to keep coming back to. What war actually it is. It isn't always the same thing. It's what it's become.
Because that caller was a critical voice and we haven't had many, let me go back to his question about the use of language by people on the left and whether or not it is also a polarizing force. The examples he gave, blood for oil, Bush as Hitler, etc.
Sure. I would never say anything of the kind. Mr. Bush, although illegitimately elected, is certainly legitimately the President of the United States, as ratified by the election of 2002. I do not believe, I hate people who talk about leftists and rightists anyway. I don't really even consider myself a person on the left. I think these labels are absolutely obsolete. I suppose if I had to choose, I'd still say left, but I don't want to choose because I think they're stupid labels. I don't call people leftists or rightists. I certainly don't call myself either of those things. I'm very conservative in some matters, and I'm a libertarian in other matters, which is both a left and a right position. I would never say blood for oil, and I would certainly never call Mr. Bush anything of... But not, by the way, neither does any intelligent person I know, including a lot of people who would identify with the left. This kind of language is, of course, absolutely stupid. But it's people like the caller who have to see all the opponents as one thing, you know, and we're not all one thing. For instance, when I went to the demonstration in New York, on the 15th, I had the feeling that a lot of the demonstrators were pacifists, or at least they were advocating a pacifist position. I certainly think that's true in Europe. I think pacifism is a very widespread position. In, of all places, Germany. Germany is now a country, I suppose we should be very glad, since Germany plunged Europe into 3 horrible wars. 1870, well, that was just France, and then 1914 and then 1939. You have a country in which pacifism is probably the leading position among people. So when they are objecting to the proposed war, when they're demonstrating against it, they're demonstrating from a pacifist position. That's a different position from mine. I'm not a pacifist. So I think you can't call it all leftism. I think these words are just kind of mud in your head. They don't help you understand anything.
Los Angeles, good afternoon.